Welcome to the Arvams podcast, where we discuss the intricacies of historical fencing. Today's guest is Martin Fabian.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're back with Martin Fabian. Martin, how are you doing?
Hey, everybody. I'm good. How are you?
Good. So we've got two books to discuss in this podcast episode. We had originally planned on one, but now there are two, which is incredibly exciting because from what I've heard, Hans Metal's out there just blowing people's minds, which is a lot of fun.
Mission accomplished.
Yeah. Where do you find the time for all of this? What's going on?
I don't. That's the real deal. Like, I don't. It has been quite a sacrifice. I mean, everybody who's ever wrote something understands what I'm saying, but you know, I'm not a full-time writer. I wish I was, and then again, I wish I wasn't. I'm happy I'm not a full-time writer. So, Fechtbuch Fabian was written in two stages because originally I wrote a book in Slovak, and then I've got quite some demand to translate the book. And as I started translating the book, it grew, and it grew and grew and grew. And yeah, it took me almost a year of work if I count both. And Medal was also written twice, so first time in Slovak, and then I translated and expanded it slightly into English. And you know how it goes. I mean, I've got regular life, I've got a regular job, and then I don't have free time. So most of that was done in the evenings up to the night, and etc. I mean, perhaps one of the things that allowed me to do it was the fact that I can manage. I'm the boss of my own time, so I don't necessarily have to work from, I don't know, 9 to 7 or 9 to 5 or whatever. I don't know. America is like 9 to 9, right? That's like endless work.
No,
We also have vacations and stuff.
Yeah.
So that probably helped, but still it took a lot of time to finish it. So I don't really find the time. It is crazy. I hate doing it. I always like kind of regret, but once it's finished, you know, like, you forget about the negative things about the creation process. So now everything
it's like
is good.
Giving birth, you know. They say that like birth is one of the most traumatic things that women can go through. My wife could attest to that. And then, you know, like afterwards, there's a point. They call it like the golden period where like basically all the hormones that you're experiencing in the birthing process basically wipe away your memory completely. And in like 3 months afterwards, you're like ready to rock and roll or something like that. It's probably not 3 months, but yeah, probably like 6 or 9, whatever. But
it's even worse with a book which is almost 500 pages, you know, because it's like, okay, Martin, so you get these questions like, so you wrote there, and you're like, what did I write? You need to remember, right?
Yeah. No, I get that. Sometimes when I go back through back catalogs of articles that I've written, I'm like, hey, I wrote that. That's actually that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
I forgot about that.
Yeah, I totally get it.
Yeah,
we get it.
So let's start with Fechtbuch Fabian. To me, this book is one of a kind. I immensely enjoyed it. You sent me a copy to read. It took me some time to get through. That's why it went from a 1-book podcast to a 2-book podcast. But I also tried to be as thorough as possible. I don't want to, you know, I don't want to be that guy that's just like, yeah, we're going to talk about a book that I haven't read. But either way. What's interesting about this book to me is that it kind of harkens back to a lot of the books that were published in the 2000s, where it's more like interpretive in terms of like how you're explaining things, which is kind of important and something that I think we really need. What was your chief motivation behind producing the book?
The original motivation goes back to 2017 when I recognized my mortality and I wanted to leave something behind. Yeah, I mean it's a joke, but
That's
it's
so
partially
stoic.
like that. I'm always trying to imagine that perhaps, I mean, if the world doesn't burn in a nuclear fire or whatever, like perhaps in 500 years people will be arguing about some aspects of my book. And it's funny because I think it's like pretty straightforward, but that's funny. That's certainly motivation. But the main motivation was I've had plenty of different translations on my hard drive ever since, I don't know, 2007 or whatever. So for about 10 years back then. And I decided that I should probably make a book of some of them. And I created a book which is not available in English yet. It's my first. It's called Master Lichtenauer's Fencing. And it is a collection of the most notable works, or some of the glossas in Lichtenauer's lineage, along with the Döbringer text and stuff like that. So it like kind of presents the whole corpus of the Lichtenauer's art. And the process was painful. That was the first book I wrote, and it also took quite a lot of time. I had to retranslate everything anew. It wasn't just putting my old translations together. And when I finished that, I was like extremely motivated. I was like, yeah, now I'm done. Let's do another book. Let's do another one, and then another one. And I started working on my older translation of Speer, or the text that we know as recognized as Hans von Speer, right? So I did most of it. Then I realized that perhaps it would be of a bigger value if I added some introductory chapters which would explain stuff which is not to be found in the text, and explain stuff in a way which is more appropriate than just using footnotes, because footnotes are limited. Footnotes should just guide you through the actual work and not take all the concentration from the work itself, right? So, and after a week or so, I was suddenly laying there with 100 pages of material, which was like the first version of the Fechtbuch Fabian. And I was like, damn, like this is getting out of hand, right? So, and then I started thinking like, okay, it's not as easy. And if I want to present the art in a comprehensive way, it's not going to be a project for a month or two. This is going to be like a big, long project. And I said, okay, I need a break, like a serious break from writing, because it has eaten up, I don't know, 3 or 4 months of my life with the original Master Lichtenauer fencing book. And then suddenly 3 years passed because I kind of forgot. And, like once you get out of it, it's really hard getting back into again. It's a lot of work. Like seriously, if you imagine, or at least the way I write or I create, I cannot just sit with the material for an hour and write something. I usually do it in chunks of 10 to 14 hours, right? So I have quite a discipline, so I just sit down and just spend, 10, 12, 14 hours just working on the stuff, like typing like crazy. So the Fechtbuch Fabian is able to exist because of two things. The first thing is COVID. So it was the first lockdown we had. Okay, so it was the first serious lockdown, because in Slovakia, like, you remember 2020, like everything was like super crazy. And then winter came, and our government said, like, no, everybody's going to be locked at home. And I was like, Jesus Christ. So it's going to be at least 2 months in the worst months of the year, like eternal darkness, no socializing, no nothing. So either I'm going to drown in alcohol and get fat, or I will find something creative. And I got back to the book. And I spent like 2 or 3 months just doing nothing else, just typing endlessly, even more than 14 hours a day sometimes. And after I finished this, of course, there were some people who were like, oh, will this be available in English? And I was like, nah, I don't really want to I don't really want to, because I was trying to imagine all that work I have to put into it. So I considered trying a different thing. I paid a friend of mine who is a professional translator, and I had her translate, well, let's say maybe 30% of the book, and it wasn't really good. Like, not because she wasn't good. Like, she's perfect. She really has a good comprehensive knowledge of English, but she's not a fencer, so she doesn't really get the material. So the translation was more mechanical and stuff. And I was like, and at that moment I knew, like, oh man, I have to do it. Okay, nobody else can do it for me. I have to do it because it's my thoughts. Sometimes some things will probably change, and if I have someone else translating it, I will end up doing even worse work afterwards because I will have to correct. So I decided it's gonna be even faster like that. So it took me another 3 years until I got to it, and that was basically how Fechtbuch Fabian came to be, because I wanted to add some extra material and not draw attention from the historical sources, but then it got out of hand and it became even the largest portion of the book itself.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. I always found that when I'm writing about fencing, I kind of start to organize my thoughts on fencing a little bit better. I don't know if people do this, but I really do think that people should take notes more in terms of things that they're learning, especially if they're kind of starting out in fencing. Just so that way you're not like losing ideas. It does help to kind of like internalize ideas, and obviously you have to internalize body mechanics and stuff like that. But did you find in your fencing and in your teaching that as you were going through Fechtbuch Fabian that you were finding things that you wanted to change or kind of adapt in terms of like the practical application of fencing, or did it even help you kind of like settle on some thoughts that you might have been a little iffy on as you were going back through?
By the time when I was working on the English version, no, not really, because Fechtbuch Fabian, I think it would take me 5 more years if I had to like really systematize something, but everything in there was going in there straight out of my head. So I just created a small plan of what I'm gonna write down, like on the individual sections and on the general idea of the book, but I was just like writing straight stuff that I teach, stuff that I do, stuff that I have experienced and seen. All right. So, but what you say it's absolutely true. It's absolutely a valid way of learning. And I think I also mentioned it at the last podcast we had together. Well, what was it, like almost a year ago, right?
It's almost
a year ago.
Yeah.
Even more,
Time
perhaps.
flies, man.
That I'm a really big proponent of an approach which is called learning by teaching. All right.
Mm-hmm.
And learning by teaching means that if you have to get an idea and explain it to other people, you have to take a completely different approach to the topic. Okay, one thing is like internalizing something. So, for instance, you learn how to cut properly. Okay, you know how to perform the physical movement, but if you need to teach it to someone else, then you have to look at the movement from a completely different perspective, and that particular perspective will help you to understand some other things and connections behind the movement itself, and it kind of connects with all the other techniques and stuff. So I think that what was more helpful towards the material itself is my experience with teaching, because I've been teaching since 2004, which is a lot of time, and I mean I'm still learning along the way. I'm trying to be better in this, but still it is almost it's more than 20 years of teaching. And if you teach something for 20 years, you don't necessarily have to be best in it, like in the physical way, but you will find ways of how to convey the idea to other people. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that from all the things that are there, I think teaching was the most helpful in systematizing and internalizing general ideas about like fencing and everything else.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. When my instructor, when I was still taking a lot of classes and not teaching,
Yeah.
he at some point told me, he kind of came up in Kuksul 1, and he basically told me, like, where you're at right now with your movement and the way that you approach fencing is kind of like what we would equate to like a red belt. And if you want to kind of like take that next step, you need to start teaching. And I found that when I started teaching seriously, even just teaching beginners and focusing on the fundamentals, and in the last podcast we talked a lot about fundamentals, and how you train fundamentals a lot. And that's one of the things that I find, like if I'm talking to people and encouraging them to kind of get involved with fencing in some way in a teaching capacity, and they're like, I just don't want to, I don't want to go back through the beginner material or teach the beginner material. I'm like, that is the thing that is going to help you grow the most. You have no idea.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
that's the place right there. So, because I agree with you in what you said, that like it really kind of helps you see it differently and even make adjustments that you might need to make, because you're asking somebody to correct their form in some way, and then it makes you more self-critical of your own form.
Yeah. Absolutely. This is the way. The only downside is, and I'm always talking about this with my instructors or the instructors in our club, is they don't want to teach because they will lose their own time for practice.
Right.
So, but then again, I always tell them, like, this is your practice.
Yeah.
This is your practice, right?
For sure. I mean, I guess, there's definitely I want to do the advanced stuff. I want to kind of do the more technical stuff, but I don't know. The longer I've done this, I used to see that as like the big shiny object, but it's almost like fencing, like you see people want to kind of, I don't know, do like a Meyer rose, right? They just want to learn the skill of doing a Meyer's rose, but because they just want to look flashy and be able to do this cool move in fencing, but they never kind of solidify the fundamentals of tempo, timing, footwork, and the really solid things that make you a great fencer. And they can do really cool sword flourishes, but when it comes to actual fencing, they get stabbed in the face.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, with this style of book, in a way, in the modern age of HEMA, right? That's a weird thing to think about. We call it third generation HEMA, because I think we've started into the third generation, right?
Yeah.
This is kind of a unique book. We haven't seen a lot of books like this come out in the last 2 decades. There's been a big, I think in second generation HEMA, there was a big push to get as many of the translations out as possible, which is important. It's very important. But this is something that we haven't seen a lot of. And from people that I've talked to in the community, it's had a tremendous impact. People are poring over it and super excited about it. So why do you think that we haven't seen books like this published? What would you like to see more of?
In a way, if you look at it, we are recreating what has happened with fencing 500 years ago. All right, because in a way, let's say like Lichtenauer is of course long dead, probably.
Right.
But we have his text. I mean, we don't know if there were like direct pupils, if it's like all fake or whatever. I mean, we had access to direct text, and it was like a holy scripture to us, right? It is like a Bible, right. And then everybody was like, "Oh, you cannot. We have to follow exactly what is written there because it's like this holy text." And right now we're getting to Renaissance, when people are not really afraid to, to pass their ideas. And when I say not really are, I will also correct myself and say they should not be All right. So, like I told you in the beginning, when I was just this book existed as a concept, I saw it as a guide towards studying old sources, right? But the more and more I put myself into it, I realized like it's my own book. You know, I'm a capable fencer. I've been fencing for 22 years or whatever, and I think that some of my ideas are okay to share, and I shouldn't be like shy to share. I don't have to be 100% correct. No, it's a very seldom somebody, of course, is. And I also have some ways which are like very individual, tailored to my own movement and stuff. But then again, it's the same thing which was happening in the Renaissance with Renaissance masters, right? Once people learned how to read and write more, once writing and publishing a book became an easier job, then you have like zillions of books from Italian masters and all the other people just trying to explain their ideas on fencing, their take on fencing, which of course sometimes comes from a certain tradition, so there are some boundaries to what they do, but they are telling their own ideas, right? So that's what's happening right now. And of course, I'm not like, I mean, I'm a confident person because, I mean, if you fence, you have to be confident. You have to be confident into your sword, into your approach, I don't know, in your cut, etc. And I would say I am a confident person. But then again, originally the book in Slovak isn't called Fechtbuch Fabian. It's just, you know, like a subtitle for the book. So originally it was called a fencing book because I was like, oh, I cannot call it a Fechtbuch Fabian because, you know, that's like, it's not really okay towards the old masters and stuff. And then I realized, like, why the heck not? Like what's stopping me? Like, I can do whatever I want at the end of the day. And even if people don't like it, I mean, I wanted to name it Fechtbuch Fabian because I like Fechtbuchs, and this is my homage to Fechtbuchs of the old time. I want to pass a certain knowledge which was actual 500 years ago, but of course I am passing it as Martin Fabian. I'm not Johannes Lichtenauer, I'm not Hans Stahlhofer, I'm not even, I don't know, John Clements or whoever, right? I'm Martin Fabian, so I decided to be a bit more confident with the stuff that I want to say, and I decided to kind of trademark it with my own name, right? And what is perhaps even more important, I realized if I do it, if I break this taboo, more people are going to do it. And I want people to do it. I want to read books by, I don't know, Ante Golbrichsky. I want to read book by Josh Dale or whoever, because they are fantastic fencers, and I would really like to read their ideas on fencing. Okay, I mean, videos are cool. Of course, the world right now works on videos and even shorter videos because of our diminishing attention spans. But a book is a perfect medium which will endure the test of time. And
That's right.
Whether you have a system ready in your head or whether you are creating the system as you write the book, you will still put information in there in a more concise manner as if making a video. It's like a completely different format, all right? So I always hoped if I do this, if I break this taboo that, oh Jesus Christ, he's saying his own ideas, his own opinions on, I don't know, Lichtenauer techniques. He even says he doesn't like this particular technique or it doesn't work. I mean, oh my God. I mean, yeah. I mean, you may think different, but this is like my idea. Here are the explanation why I think about this like that, or why I do things in this and that way. And you are absolutely free to do it yourself. All right. So this was definitely a plan of mine to perhaps help to break a taboo and also like to push, for instance, translations a bit further, because as you might have noticed, I mean, thank you for reading the book. I really appreciate that you took time to read my ideas. But as you can see, I like footnotes, or at least I like to explain stuff so people get something more out of it. Because just doing a mechanical translation, you know, it's no longer 2000. So I think what's most helpful is explaining to people like why the historical masters were saying like do this without any pairing, like, you know, I was completely confused by this 20 years ago. Why should I pass on this confusion if already the meta and all our knowledge has changed about it, and I can explain it to someone, so they will get a better understanding from the source material, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and the footnotes are funny. Like some of them, I think I messaged you at some point when I was reading, and I was like, one of my favorite parts about the book is that it's like, it's so concise in certain parts, but then you read the footnote and it's got like humor in it, and it just feels like it's both parts of Martin Fabian. Like you're in this book for sure. I know that people don't always do that. One of my favorite footnotes, by the way, not in Fechtbuch Fabian, but just like all time, is in Jarek Swenger's translation of Marazzo. There's one of Marazzo's Mezzospada techniques is you kick the person in the testicles, and then you strike a gallant pose. And Swenger's footnote is subjective gallantry. I don't know if he meant that to be funny. I don't know if he was like intending to be funny, but it cracks me up every time I see it. Yeah. But you know.
But historical masters they were the same. Like for instance, when you read Lekuchner, right, and that's something I congratulate everyone who manages to finish Lekuchner, because it's a lot of stuff. But anyways, you can feel the guy from the work. You know, it's like Fabrice or someone. Also, like Fabrice is a very good writer in this regard, or even I don't know Capufero perhaps. But Lekuchner. You know that he was like an extremely funny and eloquent dude, right? The way how he forms his ideas, how he throws all of those amens and pearls for the swines and stuff, like just randomly throw stuff at you. I mean, you are sure he was having fun, you know, like it was a lot of writing. It must have taken him a lot of time to finish that writing on parchment and stuff. But he still had a great sense of humor, you know, and this is it, because I want the readers to have contact with me. I mean, this is me, right? And then they get something more because they feel that you're human, that they can identify with your ideas better because they will understand you more as a person. Like if I understand that Lekuchner was a funny guy, you know, then all the checkers or whatever he's playing in there, right? Backgammon, I think it was.
Backgammon, yeah.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense, and his approach and all of his techniques, etc.
Yeah, I you know, it's funny because I'm gonna say something that's gonna probably upset some people, but I don't give a shit. You know,
that's the spirit.
It's interesting because in a way, to me, like passing on your ideas and being an effective teacher is a rite of mastery, right? Like that's generally how all of the ancient authors perceived what they were doing in a lot of ways. Like if you were in a painting school in Florence, let's say you were in the Florentine Academy, you would train under a master for, you know, roughly 5 years. And then after that 5 years, you would spend the next 5 years working on your masterpiece. And on the completion of your masterpiece, if it was deemed by other masters to be a masterpiece, then you would be declared a master. And then you could start taking students and, you know, they would learn by helping you. And it's interesting because, you know, that we've created this negative connotation around the word master or mastery in some way, which I think is really stupid, because I think that we're all in our journey striving for some sense of mastery, but mastery is not necessarily the final like stage, right? Like you don't become a master and then all of a sudden like you're the best, right? I think that there's kind of a confusion between Eastern and Western martial arts in that regard. Mastery to, you know, whether you're in Germany or in Italy, you know, being a master just simply meant you're a teacher, and that you're a good teacher, and that's how you would be judged as a master, was your ability to teach. At least, like if you were to read Marazzo and Manciolino, that's how they would That's what they say, right? It's not you. They even say that you could be a crappy fencer and you could be a good teacher and be a master,
Yep.
right? So like this to me is a masterpiece, and it's very masterful. So yeah, I think it's interesting. How do you feel about that? Do you feel like this is a masterpiece?
I mean, when you study university, both in Europe and USA, I think you're gonna end up with a master's degree, right?
That's correct.
You know, and then again, I think everybody who has got romantic ideas or notions about historical fencing masters should read Hans Medel. I mean, we will get to it probably later today. But if you read their criteria on becoming a master, so you needed to pay someone for quite some time, right? Then that guy will write you a letter. You will use to travel somewhere where you can go and attend like a fencing feast, whatever. You need to fence a few guys, and then they take you in. They ask you some questions, and you give them more money. Then they decide to make you a master, right? So. I mean, of course, there was probably some filter, and they also point to those filters directly in the text, but it's about having time or dedicating time to a particular activity and also putting some money into it, and that's what gets you a master's title, right? So, I don't know. I mean, from master, it's such a word. What does it even mean? You know, like it doesn't have much meaning for me. I'm primarily a fencer that I have put my ideas together in a book. Yeah. But I don't know, if you look at it from let's say maybe an Eastern perspective, I don't know. You tell me. You know, I mean, I don't have to.
Well, I think from a Western perspective, right? Like I think we can define it. I just think it means teacher, and I think or one who teaches, and I think that I would consider this a masterpiece, and I would consider you a master. I mean, and I know that's gonna like really throw people for a loop, and they're gonna be like, "This is so dumb," and I'm totally cool with that, because to me, like, not having this conversation is really dumb, because I think. Did you listen to my podcast episode with Bob Powers by chance?
No, unfortunately not.
Okay. Yeah, we were talking about, so Aristotle talks about moral exemplars, right? And you know, we were talking about like different people that we hold as moral exemplars, like in the HEMA world, and you know, Bob, being a philosopher, took it to an even more sort of higher metaphysical level, and he was like, but the true like moral exemplar in the Aristotelian sense is Lichtenauer. It was pretty funny, but like there's stages in terms of like what you're doing in terms of setting examples for the people who are coming up below you, right? So when you write a book like this, you know, you're basically communicating to future generations that this is a pathway that they can follow to achieve a level of success that you've achieved, right? And they're going to come up with their different ideas and opinions as they're going through it, and they'll engage hopefully with other texts than just yours, right? They'll engage with the original text in some way. Because I think this book harkens back to that in a lot of ways. Like, this isn't just Martin Fabian's thoughts on fencing. Like, there's a codex in here that they can follow and that they can, you know, engage with, where they're actually engaging with historical material. So, but let's say that they do model themselves after you as they're going forward. That could be great for them. Right, you could see it could make a positive impact on the growth of HEMA as a sport, because you were very successful, and people may find success in doing this, and they may, you know, kind of incorporate your ideas as they're going along. So in that, I do think that there's a mark of transcendence that is important. And in regard to like my original question in terms of why don't we see this more, and your answer, maybe we should. I do think that we should be passing on that knowledge to future generations. Instead of isolating things within the framework of a club, right, or a country where people might be exposed to your ideas, right? Like, I mean, imagine if you had never left Slovakia and you just stayed there the entire time, right? Would anybody know who Martin Fabian was? Maybe. Like, you made pretty cool videos that everybody watched. But the fact that you traveled, again, sort of a requisite of mastery, far and wide, kind of helps to spread your ideas and expose other people to your ideas, and for them to see that there was value in them, and then incorporate them into their own fencing. So yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on the matter.
It was really nicely put. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you some voice here. So, what do you think was the most difficult part of writing Fechtbuch Fabian? Not necessarily in English, but even in Slovak.
The time. I mean,
The time.
Back to time. It's always the time. I mean, for me, I like writing as such. I used to be like an essayist ever since I was in high school. I did write a lot. So writing itself is not that difficult for me. If you need a paper on a topic, I mean, I'm like ChatGPT, except the knowledge, of course. I have to get the knowledge somewhere, but I can like write text on demand, and but just the time. It's like I said in the beginning, it's like an immense sacrifice. Okay, you're also giving a part of you, and it costs you. For instance, it cost me 5 months of my life. Well, just the English version, right? 5 months of my life. I didn't really have a summer. I didn't really go anywhere. I didn't really go for a vacation. I didn't go to swim in a sea. I just spent every single day. I wanted to use a different word, but this is a good podcast. I will not use it. I spent every single day doing this, and I had this regime. It was like 35 degrees outside, which is like, I don't know, 100 American Fahrenheit. Mm-hmm. And I was there in my underwear just and then at around like 1 or 2 a.m. when everybody was asleep, and also your organism goes into a certain mode of tiredness and stuff, I just opened a can of beer on my balcony and I was just watching the night city, and just like cooling down. So I would say this is the sacrifice I made. I didn't really meet friends. I didn't really go into the city. I just spent 5 months of doing nothing else but this. So this is the biggest challenge.
Yeah.
Nothing more, because the fencing was there, I've been fencing in a certain way. I don't really make up things. I mean, when I say I don't make up things, of course I make up my own ideas, but I mean, I drew them from my practice. Okay, I didn't come with some new approach that I didn't use before or didn't mention before in teaching someone or by analyzing the stuff I do. So that was easy. It all comes down to time, and if you're ready to do a sacrifice like this. And I know a few writers, like professional writers, who write novels and stuff, and there are some people who have already written like, I don't know, 70 or 80 books in their life, and that's something.
Yeah, that is.
I mean, I cannot really imagine how people do that. But I think it's just practice. It's the same what I do. You just find a better way, or you just optimize the time that you use, right? Because you immediately know, okay, so I will first write a concise summary of what I'm gonna do. Then I will, I don't know, sketch some characters, and then you just and do stuff. So perhaps this is easier, but it all comes down to time.
Do you know who Stephen Pressfield is? He's an author. He's a historical fiction author. He was a Marine, and then when he got out of the Marine Corps, I think he was in Vietnam, and he ended up basically coming back, and America was crazy, and he couldn't find a job, so he lived in a van down by a river with his cat.
Nice.
And he decided he was going to start writing. You may be familiar with some of his movies that have been inspired by his books, like The Legend of Bagger Vance. But he wrote a book. He writes a lot of historical fiction about like classical history. But he wrote a book called The War of Art, which is a really good book. I recommend anybody and everybody read it. It's very short, but it's really good. It kind of gives his background. But one of the things that he talks about, and this, when you were talking about kind of getting inspired and kind of captured by the writing and writing for like 14 hours straight, he calls that the daemon. That's a Greek word for genius. And it kind of like, it captures you and just kind of like propels you. And you'll see a lot of like people who talk about writing, and encouraging people to get into writing more. We'll talk about how you should just sit down for 15 minutes, and dedicate 15 minutes if you're having trouble kind of like getting it into your routine, and you'll find yourself sitting for hours once you finally like engage with that 15 minutes, once you kind of get into it. So it's interesting that you said that, because
there's perhaps one more thing, but which was like extremely complicated, and I think it's working with the original translations, but not again like translating the meaning, because the meaning is easy. But for instance, translating the Lechner, it means you cannot just translate Lechner. You have to look at all the versions of Lechner. Okay, so we have in total, let's say there are like 3 basic versions, maybe perhaps 4, depends on how you look at it, and some more reproductions. And the thing is, like, people in medieval times weren't very good with grammar. They weren't very good with writing in general. They were also like tired when they copied the books and stuff, so they make a lot of mistakes, and it takes a lot of energy. Perhaps Michael Chidester will understand what I mean. Like, if you are looking at those 3 or 4 different texts, when you're looking at pictures, and when you're also trying to translate it. I was basically translating it into 2 languages, right? So first it existed in Slovak, but of course I had to make it completely more or less brand new into English. But then again, English isn't as you can hear, English isn't my primary language, or I'm not a native speaker, so it means that I had to be extremely careful of how I translate things, so everybody understands that even that it's even written in a way that native speakers will understand what I'm trying to say. And some of the things which again Lechner has, which are extremely complicated wrestling devices, like grab your arm here, shoot your arm there, step there, and do this. First, you have to visualize the thing, okay? Because you cannot just translate it. You have to understand what Lechner means. You have to have the whole situation in your head. Then you have to find the algorithm. You have to analyze whether the historical algorithm works also in modern language. And then you have to translate it piece by piece. Then you have to also make like decisions of how to translate certain things, because German is I love German. German is a great language. It's like very logical. It's like all of Germany, right? Of course, it reflects the people that live in the culture, but there are things like durchgehen, durchfahren, durchlaufen, etc., which are terms which could be translated in the same way. They make a lot of sense in German, but sometimes translated into different languages, they don't make the same sense. They don't make the same sense because other languages work and construct syntax in a different way, right?
Right.
Like, for instance, English works in clauses, idioms, and phrases, whereas German is like prefixes, suffixes, endless word conjunctions and stuff, right? So this was definitely challenging, and mainly on your attention and attention span. Because, for instance, if within a day, let's say, I could translate 10% of Lechner within one day, it meant that I had to see 4 times as much text and other stuff, and then cross-reference it back, because you also have to look into those different versions. You have to say like, okay, but in the Munich version, they add this little detail when they say it's your left hand, which suddenly makes the whole thing make sense. And then if you look at the picture, which is again somewhere completely else, this is when you get it. So this was also like kind of complicated, but of course less of a sacrifice than finding time for something like that. I mean, I was cursing a lot, man. It was like, okay, I'm not gonna like beep 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 beep. That was my whole evening working with Lechner. I mean, I hate the guy, I love the guy. It's a love-hate relationship, definitely.
I hear that a lot from people who translate texts. They learn to love and hate everything that they're working on. I know when Stephen was working on Altoni, he definitely felt that. He hated Altoni at certain points. He said that was so hard. But then he said everything else was so easy. But I do think that's interesting. And this is something, this is one of my things, like talking about second generation HEMA kind of being the translation generation. One of the things that I find is there's going to come a point where people are going to have all of these great translations. And one thing that I'm going to encourage fourth generation to do, because third generation is going to write books like yours, right? Fourth generation needs to come out and retranslate everything with their new knowledge of fencing, right? Because I think, like, right now, we're primarily working on, like, from the Bolognese context, I'll just take that. Like, we've got Jarek Swinger and Tom Leone as, like, our two primary translators for most of the Bolognese texts. But their ideas on fencing are so, like, 1990s, And so there were things that I think that they translated. For example, in Marazzo, when Marazzo wants you to give a seminal thrust in an engagement, the word that he uses is cacciare, which means to hunt. But they took the more kind of easy, colloquial translation of push. So they always started out to push a thrust. But that's not the meaning that Marazzo is really trying to give. He wants you to kind of start the process of a provocation, right? So he wants you to hunt. It's a driving hunt, like you're pushing animals out of a forest. So it's interesting because, like, when you develop the knowledge of fencing and you're starting to look for these things, engaging, even being able to engage with the original language, if you can, kind of like take a step back and look at the text in the original language and compare it to the translations that you're working from. It really gives you a different perspective.
Yeah.
You, next time you're in the States for an event, we're going to, which will be, hopefully will be Oktoberfest next year. You need to take Kendra Brown's classes that she's been doing. She has been doing, Kendra, have you met Kendra?
It's Michael's spouse?
His partner, yeah. And she has been teaching these classes where she's doing, like, comparative interpretation between different texts in different languages. So, like, her class that she was doing last year was Latin Lev versus German Lev, and giving people a translation of German Lev and Latin Lev and having them, like, compare, like, how they actually develop their translation based on the language that it's in.
So I saw the class this year when I was in Canada.
Okay.
At Amici Armis. Yeah. She made the class over there, and this is a funny thing you're saying, because recently I've been thinking about Paulus Hector Meyer, and I mean, you are obviously well versed in German things as well, but for instance, you're probably familiar with the position that we call Alber.
Mm-hmm.
Alber, right? So here's the thing. in the Latin version of his work, there is the word they use for alber, and it's like populus, which is like Latin for a poplar tree, right? And everybody's like,
Interesting.
of course, including me, everybody's like, oh, of course, it makes sense because, I mean, it grows quickly from the ground, or it has a huge, Michael Chidester, he recently said, like, it has got a huge crown over its head and stuff, you know, like, of course, we're trying to get the meaning. But I was thinking, like, what if Paulus Hector Mayer just paid someone who was versed in Latin to make a translation, and they made an error in translating the word alber, because we know that alber had most probably a very different meaning. It was like a simple, direct, straight, whatever. And what if the guy just made a mechanical translation? What if it was the same, like with this friend of mine who was originally translating Fechtbuch Fabian into English? Like, she did it like good. People could probably understand what she was saying, but it wouldn't be the same because she's not a fencer. What if this is exactly the situation where we draw conclusions upon, you know, like wrong basis?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Definitely. That's a very real possibility. And it's interesting because I feel like that's like Paulus Hector Mayer is so weird. I was going through Paulus Hector Mayer's sword and buckler section. And you know, he basically expands on a lot of Paulus Cowell's sword and buckler plays, which, if you look at Paulus Cowell, they're basically like, there's like one sentence in terms of like what is actually going on in the play, and you're supposed to kind of rely on the picture a little bit more. But if you look at Paulus Hector Mayer, he's got like a block of text, like a huge block of text, and he's like, yeah, so this is what actually happens. And it's like, all right, Paulus Hector Mayer, like, where did you come up with that interpretation? Like, this is you. Like, this is totally you. So I don't know.
The man was absolutely crazy. So, you know, when I finally like cracked metal, like, I'm not saying I understand metal 100%, but let's say 95% of the stuff that we can deduce and understand is there already. I was like, yeah, what about Paulus Hector Mayer? You know, like, I know there is a plenty of translations out there of Paulus Hector's material, but there's not really anyone who would like really do Paulus Hector Mayer and explain those techniques, because they are very difficult to interpret because of the way how he described it. You know, like even the pictures, they sometimes just show individual sides of what's happening. They don't necessarily show the particular technique in action, etc. And his way of writing, if it was like him who wrote the stuff, if it just wasn't some guy writing down what he was dictating or whatever, so it's extremely difficult. And I was like thinking like, should I do Paulus Hector Mayer next? But then I'm like, no way, this is not for me.
That's the rest of your life, man.
No, this would break anyone like sane enough, because it's such a huge undertaking. You know, I mean, some of his plates and whatever it is are very straightforward. You can get the meaning immediately, but there are some plates which would take you just days thinking or trying to figure out like what's going on. And in order to do Paulus Hector Mayer, you really have to be extremely well versed in all the works that he owned. Okay, so
exactly.
Very good with, I don't know, Wallerstein. You have to be extremely good with Jörg Wilhelm. You have to be really, really good with Hans Medel, because also some of the Medelian things, they appear in there. So I think that's the big task of the generation of the fourth generation of translators and interpreters. It's like finding someone who will be both brave and knowledgeable enough to crack Paulus Hector Mayer in a different way than just pure translation, like really full-on interpretation of what's going on.
I think Mayer is so interesting because he is like the first universalist too, you know?
Yeah.
Like, if you look at Paulus Hector Mayer's material, it's like, because Roberto Gotti found a copy of Marazzo that Paulus Hector Meyer owned. And so, I mean, there's stuff in there. Like if you look at his Sprechfenster guard, that's Marazzo. That's Guardia di Testa. And so, like, yeah. So, like, what all did he take from the Italian texts? Like, did he like co-opt certain things from Marazzo and kind of incorporate it into? And what sections did he do it in? You know, you have to have such a broad knowledge of fencing to really kind of dig in and understand what the influence is that you're looking at. That he poses some serious problems, but interesting problems, right? Like, I mean, if someone were to follow that path, right, really study the texts, like you said, that were kind of his foundational material, and come to a conclusion on something that makes sense, it would be amazing, because I mean, he's the first universalist in a lot of ways, you know. That's such a bad word these days. People hate that when you talk about like universalism in fencing.
Yeah.
I get in trouble for that a lot. But I don't know. I mean, there are definitely some universal concepts. So I don't know. I think it's great, and I look forward to that when we finally see it.
Really getting close to Paulus Hector Meyer, you know, like
Yeah.
I of course know that there are people also like Jeff Tay has started a series on Paulus Hector Meyer. He has got a bunch of videos, and even he has like one. I think he was trying to decipher the Schilhau technique, or at least one of the Schilhau plates, right? And he was like saying on video like, this is not really clear. And of course, I mean, he's right, because it's it's written like extremely in a difficult way, but we're getting there. We're slowly getting to the place where we will have enough knowledge to be able to understand what Paulus Hector Meyer is saying, right? Paulus Hector Meyer, it's impossible it would have been deciphered like 10 or 15 years ago, because only thanks to our practical experience, only thanks to resurfaced manuscripts or treatises or whatever, or prints, right? We will be able to fully decipher what's going on, to fully decipher all of these like little call-outs back to Marozzo or to whoever, you know, like only, you know. So if you didn't have the copy of Marozzo, would you, or if you didn't like understand Marozzo fully, would you understand Paulus Hector Meyer, Guardia di Testa, or his like Brandfenster or whatever? I mean, you wouldn't. You have to take this little optic which comes from the Italian fencing and apply it there. Without that knowledge, it would be just like an empty technique for you.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a weird amalgamation. Like, it doesn't really make sense that would be Sprechfenster. I don't know. At least the way that I see Sprechfenster, but maybe that's another conversation for another time. We could probably do a whole podcast on Sprechfenster. You know, obviously, like, we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but, you know, Fechtbuch Fabian is much more than your ideas on fencing or your interpretation of the KDF tradition. It also contains a translation of the Speyer Codex. For those who aren't aware, what is that, and why is it important to you?
So, Speyer Codex is important to me because it speaks to me on a certain way, in a certain way. The thing is, if somebody is, of course, doesn't know a lot about the German manuscripts, it is that most of the stuff that we have in German about Longsword is copied, okay? It's copied. It means that there was some manuscript or some work which other guys copied. Probably someone on the way added something, or of course the traditions sort of like diverts in different directions. But Speyer in particular is one of the first works in the Lichtenauer lineage which has got original additions, okay? And original additions, there's not a lot of them. There's like, 2,000 maybe of these additions. But along with some other stuff which appears in the manuscripts, they make it more personal. Okay, so it means that the person who wrote it, copied it, or whatever, we don't know. We can, of course, just guess what was going on. But the person who probably like wrote or copied it put something of their own soul, of their own thinking and understanding of fencing. They do stuff which is like heretical, or we can say that it's heretical. It means that they take a technique out of Messer and they put it into Longsword. They add it together, they merge it, which is like thing which goes against the original secret clause of the Master Lichtenauer. Okay, so it means that for me in particular, reading this manuscript, seeing like the signature of Hans von Speer or Johannes de Zeinissen de Novacivitate, okay, seeing it, like there is a guy who put his name in there. There is a guy who probably made all these little notes on the way, some of the jokes which can be found over there, and he also made some mistakes. So for me, it's an original work, okay? As much as you can be original with these copies of compilations of historical manuscripts, right? So this is why it always spoke to me in a different way. And there's just a handful of other works that, I mean, talking about Longsword, of course. I mean, if we talk about Italians, okay, Italians are just subjective. There is nothing else, just their persona all over the place. But talking about the German stuff, there's but a few outliers which help you immensely to interpret the art, and that's the Döbringer manuscript, or Paul Hausbuch, how it's called nowadays. There's Hans von Speer for me, and then there's Joachim Meyer and Hans Medel. Okay, I mean, probably if I fought for a little longer, I could come with maybe some more, but this is for me personally the most interesting works in the history of German longsword, because again there is a subjective element to the work, so we are reading something where a particular persona gave more than just copy some text blindly. Okay, we don't know which of the manuscripts is like closer to the original. We can just guess on some linguistic analysis on which works probably stem from where, but these works, since they are different, they show us the contrast between what's theirs and what was probably like original, right? And since we can know these little things, it helps us to interpret this thing. So Speer, for this particular reason, because it's like very short, very concise, at least in both Lichtenauer and Leckuchner, because also the abridged version of Leckuchner, which appears in the Hans von Speer manuscript, is my favorite because it's the shortest. There's the least amount of unnecessary stuff. Again, not using vulgar language. So that's why it's my favorite, because I really like to work with it. And also, last but not the least, it kind of connects old fencing and new. It even says so. I mean, of course, this is a thing which already appears in the Lel or Ju-Lu manuscript, or we call it Ju-Lu. I mean, it's not really Ju-Lu, but it's probably something else. But it also reiterates this idea, like it connects the so-called new Zettel, which is the Martin Sieber Zettel, with the old but good Zettel. Okay, so already in the second half of 15th century, they recognized that the Lichtenauer stuff is like a good solid basis, but it's like the common knowledge already. And here we have Martin Sieber, who was, I don't know who, I mean, someone whose fencing had some influence in a particular region. I mean, at the end of the day, we can find his traces all over Joachim Meyer's manuscript. All right, so therefore, for me, the working with this particular work, because it always stands somewhere on the side, people are not really interested in it. They mostly work with Danzig or Ringek, because, I mean, the name has a good ring to it, right?
Yeah.
So I wanted to bring, again, something which is different, something where I will point out, like, hey, this is interesting because, and like I said before, it's quite personal for me. It adds some spice.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. Because I've been reading metal, and I love the personalization of it. I know we're kind of blending the two now, but it's one of those things where, like, sometimes his notes or even the things that he discusses that don't necessarily align with what I know of the RDL texts, also kind of like really hit with my experience in fencing. And I read them and I'm like, yeah, that's kind of how I thought of it, and so like it's a little bit different, but it's still like you can feel the validation through your own experience sometimes, like when you're reading through them. And I felt that way a lot with various aspects of the Speyer Codex as well. And I think I remember when I might have talked about this last time, but when Tom Leone put out the translation of the Anonymous Vienna, which is a student of Fabris' personal notes on taking classes in sort of Fabrician fencing. Like, that's just, it's so good. Even like Rob Renakis recently put out the Book of Lessons by Hereda. I know I'm mispronouncing that, but it's interesting because he was a student of Cavacabo, and he puts his own personalization and kind of expands on the lessons of Cavacabo in a lot of ways, and having that sort of like imparted knowledge, but imparted and then bolstered with practical knowledge as a sort of a second addition to the book. You can see the evolution, you can see the thought process and sort of the troubleshooting that's going on. And you're seeing what's probably a better form of what you're looking at. That's one of the reasons why, like, I've been begging somebody to do a translation of the 1568 Marazzo, because I want to see what Sebastiano Marazzo changed about his father's work and why. Like, I want to do a comparative analysis, and I want to know, like, what he was like, Dad, that was dumb, because he was a renowned fencing master. So, like, there's so much to be said for that.
And it helps you to understand that better. Because, if you want to draw an object, and if you only have a chance to look at it from up front, right? You see it only 2D, but any object is always like 3D. So you also have to you have to also understand what's not good about something. How does it look from a different side, etc., etc. And this is what exactly all those little subjective pieces give you. So if he says like, oh, that thought this, but it's crap, and then you understand that better.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's different sides of the elephant sometimes. You know that metaphor? The different sides of the elephant. Like when you're like, so if you have a whole bunch of people and they're blindfolded, right? And you have one person holding the trunk of an elephant, and then you have another person holding the leg, and then you have another person holding the tail. And let's say there's another person who has its hand on the side of the elephant, and you ask them all to describe the animal that they're touching because they can't see it. Then you're going to get some wild answers, right? But they're all describing the elephant. And so, like, the more data points that you have, the more things that you can feed into. Like, we don't know what Lichtenauer fencing looked like. Like, there's no modern exemplar that we can point to that says, like, this is the way, But what we do have is we have a whole bunch of data points that are, in some ways, give us a different part of the elephant. And anytime there's a personalized note in any book, they're describing a different part of the elephant. And that helps us to kind of build a picture of what the elephant looks like. I agree.
Well put.
Yeah. So, all right. Now, you said in Fechtbuch Fabian that Luke Kuchner really unlocked KDF for you. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah. So during the initial analysis of the old sources, when we were just doing the first interpretation, the Lichtenauer sources, they are very limited in everything they say. I mean, it's fine, it's complete, it's like a system, etc., but they don't really say anything at the end of the day. All right, they just describe a systematic way of fencing and understanding fencing, but they don't really say how to do these little important basics or details and stuff. And some things they consider, I mean, it's like us. If somebody told you to describe how a TV looks like, you would just describe it from your point of view and your experience. But if somebody would be reading this in 500 years, they would be asking, but what about the individual transistors which are hidden in the television? Why don't you speak about them? Because we don't really think about it, right? We see, I mean, it's a large screen. You would probably say the TV has a large screen. It's like usually black from the sides, and then there's a piece of glass, and then it's a beautiful picture. But but this is a TV for us. We don't really think about the technical aspects. So it's the same. For instance, let's take a Krumpau versetzen against a ox, or against an ox, against the ox guard, right? So you open up any Lichtenauer, more or less any Lichtenauer, right? And they say like, so the guy is standing in left ox, so how a Krumpau against his hands, and that's it, all right? But then you start reviewing the pictorial evidence, and then you see, hey, but this doesn't really work together, and here it seems it's like two things being done. So here it seems that the guy is first hitting the blade with the Krumpau, and then he makes a follow-up on the hands, right? But this doesn't really align well with the text. It's probably, the text must be correct, and whoever has created those illustrations must have had a bad interpretation of the art. But that might not necessarily be true, because for those people who are putting together instructions on how to do Krumpau, it was you would probably ask them like, hey, don't you hit the blade first? And they would probably say, well, of course. I mean, do I have to write it down? I mean, of course. This is like, you always do it. So again, in order to understand those limited things, we either have to have a large plethora of different sources which have like little deviations, which will eventually show you how it's done. Or you can visit Lekuchner, because Lekuchner has got everything, and he sometimes describes it in a better detail. So, for instance, he also describes this particular technique, and he says like first hit the blade and then hit the hands. Okay, so he doesn't necessarily have to have the same thing which is being described in the Longsword sources, but since he's such a vast compendium of techniques, and he sometimes uses these little notes when he says like, okay, this is how we do it in Messer, in Longsword it's done differently, okay, or he adds more, he has infinitely more pictures, well, not infinitely, but he's got many times more illustrations to individual techniques. So Lekuchner really helped me to understand Longsword in an interpretative way, because I always compared, well, not always, but most of the times, I compared what was written in the Lichtenauerian, traditional Lichtenauerian sources with the stuff appearing in Lekuchner. So, for instance, Kurzhau, I don't know if you are familiar with the Kurzhau. That's a thing which a lot of people have had problems with for many years, right? And we weren't really sure about how to do the Kurzhau, because the description in, let's say, RDL or whatever is like extremely lacking. But then when you read Lekuchner, you understood it, because Lekuchner has this thing, I think it's one of the durch, not fahren, he does the durchfahren with the hand, but durchgehen with the with the messer, right? And it's all over the manuscript. And then it becomes immediately clear. So if you are in a phase when you're interpreting the individual techniques and movements, then Lekechner is a very good to compare to, because he was certainly teaching at fencing schools. He was certainly a professional fencing master, taking money for what he was teaching. And the amount of techniques is much larger than anything left to us by, let's say, Lichtenauer's pupils or whoever those guys were. So it will always help us if, of course, we have a critical eye. So we look at those things in a critical way. It will help us to understand Lichtenauer fencing, because it like gives a mirror to us, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally get that. It's interesting. I felt like my understanding of the KDF authors got better when I looked even at somebody like Lignitzer's Sword and Buckler sources. There's some pretty clever stuff in there. And I get the idea that sometimes, like, I think there's a tendency to kind of think I need to think of this as a weapon-specific thing versus this is a complete system. And so other parts of the system are going to kind of inform like what it is that you're doing. Like there's a really big movement now in the Fiore community, in the United States at least, where almost everybody who does Fiore is doing armor training, because they see it as Fiore's kind of working. Everything that he does is preparing you for fighting in armor. So like the armor lessons in and of themselves are kind of his final lessons. And so it has this very linear progression to it. And you could argue, or even that his ideas perhaps are more like bottom up, in terms of like his armor material is what's actually informing what's below it, almost like a pyramid. And you could even say that might even be true of the KDF system. I know that there are some people who would argue that. I don't know how valid that is. I don't know enough about the German fencing tradition to argue that, but it does make sense that a martial tradition, especially if it's a martial tradition that involved teaching a lot of the nobility, would be preparing them for that eventuality. So I don't know how you feel about that in terms of kind of looking at everything is in its entirety, because I mean that's kind of what the Spire Codex does, right? Like it actually does take that like broad view of KDF, because it includes Lignitzer and it has the Zettel and it has, different portions that kind of help to solidify your understanding of the entirety of the system.
Yeah, absolutely. It serves as a bridge, like I said, it serves as a bridge between old and new fencing. I mean, they even proclaim it in the beginning, so it's a very good version of Lichtenauer, and everybody should read it.
Yeah, for sure. And they can, if they pick up a copy of Fechtbuch Fabian. They can read it in English or in Slovak if they're able. Let's see. So when you reflect back on this book, what are you most proud of?
It exists. That I mean, it's during the creation process. I mean, of course, you want to create something, but you have your doubts whether what you're doing is okay, if it's good, if people are going to like it, if it really represents your ideas well. So, of course, those doubts are everywhere. And a friend of mine, also a very good fencer, his name is also Martin Janicina. He has got really good videos on Fabris. Maybe you've seen them. They're fencing in white pants, like white sport fencing pants. Some of them are in some castle or whatever. And he's like a really, really good person. And he's been writing his own rapier book for maybe 15 years now.
Wow.
Okay. And I'm sure it's going to be absolutely amazing because he's very well versed in Italian sources. You would really love the guy even to talk about with him about all the knowledge that he has about the Italian sources. But he has been doing it for 15 years up to the point where it grew so much that he kind of abandoned it, and now he doesn't think that he will like ever finish it. I also told him at some point, like, hey, Martin, just send what you have to me. I will take a look and maybe I will help you to somehow finish it or whatever. But he's like, nah, because it's like very messy and it's like his own and stuff. So, and I'm pretty sure there are so many people around us that have been doing the same. Also, like one of my colleagues in Sigi, Andrzej Herčík, Czech guy, he's also a really good fencer, and he's been also like writing his own book, but he hasn't finished it, and who knows if he ever will. I mean, I'm always trying to give him a little nudge in that direction, but so at the end of the day, I think I'm really proud I was able to finish it. And I'm really happy about all the people who helped on the way, because of course the book is not just about me. It's also about the guy who made the design, because the design is
it's beautiful
part of any book, and it takes a lot of time to finish. And I'm always there with him all the time, and we're always like, oh, how to do this and how to do that. But ultimately, he's the one pressing the mouse buttons, right? So. And also people like Pavel Ponichtera, who is the Polish illustrator who managed to capture the movement of the fencers exactly how we wanted to, or what we wanted to achieve. So, I'm really happy that all those people who were there on the way and who helped to spark the book, and also people who, of course, inspired me with their ideas, that I've managed to finish it and perhaps even like capture the zeitgeist of 2020s or 2010s fencing era in it somehow, right, for future generations.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think that is really what it represents. I mean, to me, when I look at the illustrations and the design and the layout, it reminds me of. It kind of takes me back to the first time that you were posting videos, Sverhowing on top of a mountain, stuff like that. But, like it has such a style that really, I mean, it feels contemporary, but it also feels timeless. And I think it takes a lot of work. And I think it'll be cherished for sure for future generations. So before we transition into metal, I've got a few questions from Katie Faithful in the United States. We can call this segment the Martin's Musings, or whatever you want to call it. These are some pretty accomplished fencers across the United States who I knew had read the book, and I wanted to get their thoughts and their feelings and their questions. Some of them are not about the book, but some of them just really wanted to ask you questions. But I think that kind of stems to your influence. So, let's get into them. So if you were teaching total beginners, how would you approach it? Is the sequence of Fechtbuch Fabian designed to be good textbook front to back? Would you take a more ecological approach to get them fencing first and introduce concepts to help them solve problems as they discover them? Or would you follow the pedagogical approach of the Zettel and the glosses?
I don't think Fechtbuch Fabian is a suitable fencing book for beginners. It was more aimed at intermediate fencers, or perhaps even advanced fencers who will know what I am talking about. It's in no way any beginner needs to know the complete nomenclature or division of cuts or thrusts or whatever. I mean, that's plenty of unnecessary information. Of course, there are people who prefer to approach things in a systematic way, so they really need to learn the whole tree of information in order to conceptualize, but most people aren't like that. So I would say rather that if you've been around maybe for half a year or for a year, you have a vague idea about some concepts. You've done some sparring, so you understand that if you push someone somewhere, they will probably come from the other side, and you have the, let's say, at least some of the basic ideas about how mechanics work in fencing, then my book will be probably the most helpful. Also, if you're an advanced guy and you all have, let's say, a good grip on strategy and tactics, and then you will read about my concepts of how to approach this, and you can approach this, of course, absolutely critically and say it's bullshit, right? It will give you something, because it will be like having a discussion with me in a way, or at least an internal monologue, but not really for beginners. So, I want to write one more book, and I've already said it's not going to be Paulus Hector Mayer, but I want to write a book on didactics. I want to write like a special book which will teach people both how to teach and how to learn and how to approach like learning in general. And I think a book like that would be more helpful in this regard, but not really Fechtbuch Fabian. And if I was to teach someone fencing, coincidentally, this year, I've had 2 guys who approached me for private lessons, and they had almost no experience with fencing at all, right? So they asked me, like, are you up for the task of teaching me, even though I know nothing? They didn't know even nothing about guards, nothing about movements and stuff. So I had to figure out a way of how to get them into fencing really quickly. And, I didn't really teach them like thoroughly, like KDF principles. I didn't even explain stuff. I just make them fence, but not as sparring, of course, but I make coached repetitive drills. All right. So there are some drills, closed and semi-open drills. So it means like when we say a closed drill, it says it means that the outcome is always set, right? So this happens, you do this. When we say semi-open drill, we mean that you do this and you can do this, etc., etc. So I usually employ plenty of different drills like that, extremely concentrated, where for an hour we perform maybe 2 or 3 different techniques or concepts, and I'm trying to go around certain ideas, because the question always is, what is your goal? What is your aim? Like, are you like Hans Stahlhofer? Are you preparing someone for a duel, right, which is, on a judicial duel, so where they may lose their life because they have lost the duel? Okay, so you have 2 months to get someone to win a duel. Then you have to teach them something completely different. Let's say if our goal is to have fencers who are really knowledgeable in an academical perspective about the old sources, then it is most probably useful to take the path which people like Joachim Meyer promote, because Meyer, of course, that's the earliest concise didactics of German longsword, or to teach things as they are presented in the old sources. But if your goal is to create a fencer who will be, let's say, successful in tournaments or in sparring or generally in modern fencing with some historical knowledge, then you have to take a completely different route. Okay? Then most of the things that you want to teach them, at least in the first half a year or whatever, are completely unnecessary, because they need to learn how to move. They need to understand structure. They need to be well balanced. They need to learn how to connect things, which things connect well together. And then when you give them a certain functional basis, like they are able, let's say, to perform a simple attack, they are able to perform a pari riposte from multiple different situations. They are able to make a compound attack, and they are able also, let's say, to retreat and make simple tactical decisions. Then, at least according to how I see things, they are a fencer ready to pass on step 2, where you can teach them all the Schillhaus, all the, I don't know, Superzwerghaus or whatever. But until or unless they learn these things, it's completely unnecessary to go into any KDF structure. And believe me when I say, if they are a fencer like this, if they understand distance, tempo, are able to perform simple, compound, whatever action, pari riposte, after they know that, and you start teaching them KDF approaches and KDF logic, they will be much better in it than if you took the other way around. I mean, of course, eventually with enough time using both approaches, you can arrive to similar results. But if you are looking for a way how to get someone from A to B really fast, then you have to go in the practical way and use your practical knowledge more than the knowledge of, I don't know, 24 Winden.
Yeah, that was a great answer. I'll try to get through these questions. I do want to talk about Hans Metal, and that was good though. So next question is, you make the intriguing claim that Vomtag and Alber can both be considered long point. Is that just due to the straight arm component of those positions? Is there a strategic or tactical advantage to the mental framework?
It's not my idea. It comes from the historical sources. I didn't make this up. I mean, it appears as soon as in AJS 3227A, and also I found some inspiration coincidentally in 133 with a special Langord, like not really, but yes, because it has shown me that they were also using some specific terms and some specific concepts with a different understanding. Then I also explored some pictorial evidence, because there are illustrations of different versions of how they hold Langord. I've tried it practically. What are the things that you can do from there? And then I just realized that despite slightly different tactical potential, it's more or less the same, because you can perform the same techniques, it poses more or less the same threat, etc., etc. And similarly to rapier sources, or similarly to late Renaissance Italian fencing books, which do concern themselves with rapier, I was trying to find ways of how to explain certain concepts to people in an easier way. So like the Italians, they say, for instance, that this is the guard number 3. And you hold it like that, and it doesn't really matter if you hold it like super up front or closer to your body. What matters is the position of the hand. Okay, so again, for me, in this particular way with Langord, I want to kind of teach people that it doesn't really matter if you stay here or over there. More or less, the things that you can do from it are the same. There's maybe sometimes you pose a little more threat towards your opponent, but at the end of the day, you do the same thing. So don't think about all those things as of 3 different positions. Think of it as a same position, because you can do an Oberhau from Langord, you can do an Oberhau from Vomtag, and I don't know, whatever. I mean, more or less, it's just the same. So if you want to do a thrust from here, you have to go into the very same Langord in front of you. So just start looking at the broader picture, not just as the small picture, right? It's more a concept of a way of thinking than a particular technique.
Yeah. To me, like, there's deception kind of built into the position, right? Like if you change the position in some way, you're basically just providing a tactical puzzle for your opponent to try to figure out, like, where is this going to go? How are they going to use it? So you're complicating their like read on what you're doing. Like I wouldn't even use, kind of like what you were talking about earlier with the beginners, I wouldn't even use a more like a wider position, using Bolognese terminology, but for example, like Alber. Like if you want the same tactical application, what you're doing in Alber versus long point, if you're fighting against somebody who you've never fenced before, you're probably better off fencing from long point or like holding a long point position rather than trying to use a wide position when you have no idea how fast that person is or like what kind of skill that they have. However, if you do know what their skill is and you've already gotten a read on them, then you can use that as a tactical device to start confusing things and kind of changing the fight in whatever direction you want it to go. You know, that's a way to lie to people if you want. Mm-hmm. So, all right. So I'm going to skip through some of these. Here's a text-specific question. The Virversetzen, the 4 strikes other than Zorn, are said to break the 4 guards, but the pairing seems strange. Like Crump beating Ox, for instance, it seems like in the modern setting, we see a lot more approaches to getting someone out of guard or punishing them when they linger too long. Why do you think the text gives the advice it does?
Because it worked for them. Maybe it made some logic to them. You know, it's like with 24 Winden. I know, probably some people are not going to agree with me with some of my claims, but, you know, like 24 Winden makes sense in 70%. There are some turnings which, of course, they can happen, but we don't really do them. So it's a nice idea to say, like, oh, we have this complete system, which is like, makes a huge circle and you come back to the original idea, etc., etc. But some of the elements are there just because, you know, to fit the system itself, right? So if the particular person asking about the Virversetzen feels conflicted about their pairings, they should definitely get the medal because medal is even a worse system. But he says a very important thing. He says an extremely important thing in his commentary. He says, like, the Versetzen are there to get the person out of guard. Okay, so he sees the initial movement just as a good way of how to engage with someone in a certain position. But he says that what's important is the technique which come out of those, right? So, for instance, he says that from a particular initial position, it's easier to do this and then get into his creek or whatever else. And this is a very important piece of knowledge because it tells you, like, you don't necessarily need to hit the guy with the Krumpau. You don't necessarily need to engage them, but you need to get them moving from that particular position. And if they start to move, it's easier to deal with them if you have engaged them from that particular angle, right? And, you know, if you want to figure some of those, I mean, I'm not saying it's the only way because, I mean, I have a video on Ox in particular on how to, like, break the Ox and how to work with the Ox card. And I think I have shown most of the logical ways that we can use in order to break Ox, right? And some of those ways are working more, some are working less, but if you want to see yourself, like, try it, like, genuinely take someone, have them, let them be standing in Ox and cause trouble for you, and you will see that out of the, I don't know, 6 or 7 things that you can do because they make most sense, 1 or 2 things will make the most sense from that particular set of things, right? And that's Krumpau. Okay, that's Krumpau for us, like engaging in a way that when we're trying to keep the distance. Then again, it comes down to what is your interpretation of Krumpau, because you can have a canonical interpretation, meaning like really extremely crooked cut somewhere on the side, but you can also try to just keep your distance somewhere in front, just being somewhere slightly out of line. Okay, there are like many ways of how to engage with the opponent, right? So I would say don't really worry about particulars because there are many ways of how to break the Krump. If you're looking to understand like why Lichtenauer does it, it makes sense within that particular system, but it doesn't mean that it's the best way or the way that I would say use, because the from a tactical perspective, the best thing is just to get the other guy moving, because their options from aux are limited. So if you can do it with a Krump, I mean, good for you. If you can do it with, I don't know, Schilhau, even better, right? This is up to Okay.
I think that's kind of interesting, because like what we talked about before, and I love what Metal said, and that's, again, that kind of feeds back into my universalist mindset of thinking of fencing. Like you're always trying to solve the same problem, and what you're talking about of like getting them moving. That's exactly what Marazzo was talking about with that. What I talked about earlier with the cacciata, right? You're trying to hunt them out of their guard. You're trying to get them to move from that fixed position where they're dangerous into movement, right? Which is making them give a tempo. I know people don't like that word tempo, but it is unavoidable, right? You're forcing them to create a tempo, and when you can act indes of the tempo that they've created, and that's another thing that I really like about Metal is how he talks about indes. Sorry. So let's see. I'm going to skip some of these. All right, reading through your footnotes on Spare. 413 discussing the counter to the abnamen. I've never really thought of the counter as a small displacing short edge parry. I've always taken that action as a wind up into ox and a long edge cut like a Sverkow into the cut of the abnamen. When we get to footnote 418 about the winding action, I think we see instead of the cut, we've made a pass back and lined up a thrust, and this action is describing mutating on the blade, either to right flug to thrust from below, or mutating on the weak to right ox to stab from above. Curious about Martin's thoughts regarding the short edge in 418.
Yeah, I felt obliged to also write about this particular interpretation, because like some people do it, the problematic part about the Speer's counter to abnamen is he gives us information like, if the abnamen is coming, you parry a little. He says, like, I think it's like, I don't remember like the precise wording, but he says like parry a little with the short edge and then cut them with the short edge. But then you're like, but how? Like, I mean, a sword just has one short edge, like, short edge and long edge. It's like that, right? So how do we like arrive in this like how do we mechanically do it? Because if I parry them, for instance, if I want to do a winding in a medal style, so just turn my sword with the short edge on theirs, like a little, then I would be hitting them with the short edge as well, right? I mean, and so there's plenty of those little problems which tell us of how that it's a bit difficult. So I think, and I felt obliged to also write this option that maybe all they want to say is like just to do a little like Krump-like movement and strike them back. I mean, it might be that. It doesn't have to be that. I mean, of course, there are also other ways of how to achieve that particular technique, but I just felt obliged to write that there is also the possibility of this action being interpreted like this. Like, why not? I mean, it makes sense. It makes sense,
yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that is interesting. How do you feel about Metal's duplieren?
I mean, really good, because it just confirms my ideas.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking when I saw it. I was like, wow, this is really good. I don't know. I felt like that was a good follow-up question of my own.
Yeah, it's but this is like a good exercise for the mind, right? So,
right.
And regarding like interpretation of sources in general. So, for instance, you're talking with someone, and let's say they're a bit more conservative about things, right? And you say like, okay, so duplieren is also this, and they say, no, that's not how the duplieren is described, because duplieren is described that you're hitting someone behind their blade. They need to like give you the stuff, and then I'm like, okay, so But Lichtenauer says that there are always like two windings on one side and on the other side. Like, so how is the other one called? Like, where does it like fit into the general idea? Like they didn't have a name for it. They never used this motion, which is like the simplest motion. It's even simpler than a stupid thrust, because you don't really have to aim the point properly into someone's face. You just do the movement and you hit somehow, right? And this is exactly when you're like coming to the conclusion that like there is something missing. So then I'm like, why don't we call it dupliran? Because I mean, it is dupliran. You're still like doubling the cut in two ways, but except of going behind someone's blade, you are just stay on the same side. And then you go read Medal, and this is what Medal says, because for him, primarily, dupliran is exactly this movement. Also, Lekuchner, same thing. If you read Lekuchner, there's a shit ton of these duplirans in his text, right? And he calls it like dupliran Winden. He doesn't even care, because at the end of the day, it doesn't even matter. It just like, it helps researchers and interpreters, those guys who are doing the interpretation, it helps us conceptualize stuff. It helps us to understand some of the linguistic challenges and movements within centuries, and arriving to Paulus Hector Mayer eventually, to see how he uses the language and why is he using specific terms and specific concepts with specific techniques, because we see how the language was evolving in a certain way, right? So, but at the end of the day, it is the dupliran. Sorry, guys.
Yeah. No, that's great. So let's dig into metal here. I know I'm keeping you a long time. Do you have some time that we can talk about metal?
Of course, I have nowhere to go.
Okay, perfect. All right, so on to metal. For all those Zettel heads out there, that's my pun of the day. Michael Chittister said something really fascinating the other day. He proposed that RDL are actually the outliers in the KDF system. What do you think about that?
A nice idea. It's a nice idea. You know, like Michael is certainly one of the people who spends the most time on this planet with historical sources, and I know what it feels like. Like you get into this flow where like, and you see all the connections, and it's like the meme where the guy sees all the numbers around their head, and it's like, everything's making sense, right? And I think he might be onto something, but then again, it depends if you go into the wild aspect of things, or if you stay rigorous, because scientifically we cannot say something was certainly like that unless we have absolute evidence pointing to that particular fact. So with historical sources, it's always like that. We can say like, this is core Lichtenauer, but unless and until we will find a text that will have written like, this is authored by me, Hans Lichtenauer, and this is my way of how I see things, we can only presume, we can only have hypotheses on how things worked, right? There is what we certainly know, and what we know for certain is that there was a division in opinions on Lichtenauer's art. The question is where it started, who was the originator, and what does it really mean to have diverse opinions on Lichtenauer's art? Because, for instance, I'm more convinced that Lichtenauer was, and we have also evidence that points in that direction, Lichtenauer was just a guy who put things which already existed together, okay? So it doesn't really have to be like Lichtenauer per se. It can be that there were multiple different ways of interpreting the same thing, which were probably regionally influenced by some people being somewhere, and that existed more or less independently on each other. I mean, more or less, because of course, it was interconnected, and mainly in Germany, which was like really tight about the guilds and etc., etc. But there were probably multiple different things doing the same stuff from a slightly different direction, right? And Medal, for me in particular, is one of those. Of course, 98% of the evidence we have points to
medal being an outlier, to being someone who is heretical. I mean, I use the word heretical because I really like it and I think it fits. And that's what the evidence says. But then again, it is very much possible, due to the traces of medalism or some of the medals ideas that we find in different manuscripts, that there was like a separate, let's call it tradition, stupid word, but let's call it tradition, that there was a separate tradition which worked with the terms and concepts in a different way, but that way makes complete sense. It makes complete sense, and that's the problem with medal. It really makes sense. It's not just an opinion. His whole system, his whole approach, his whole interpretation of certain techniques makes absolute sense, can be found somewhere. So, although very small, there is a chance that all the other guys were wrong, you know? It's a really small chance, but it is there. And if we want to remain rigorous, we have to take it into account.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's great. Do you think that there's in some sense, this is a thought that I had, and I don't know if it's a stupid thought, because the Marx Bruder had a more military focus in terms of like developing Doppelsoldner and so on and so forth, and actually like feeding into the Imperial Army. Do you think that there's perhaps like that's the reason why you see difference between authors like Medal and Faulkner and some of the sort of the more like the Marx Bruder authors versus like RDL authors?
It's very hard to say. It's very hard to say, and I don't think I have like a real formed opinion on this in this way, because those things were extremely complex. From the Medal book and from the chronicles of the Marx Bruder, we can see that there was quite a difference between like what we see as traditional Lichtenauer and what they were doing. We don't know to what extent, and we don't really know how Medal fits into the whole thing, right? So, and whether this stems from the fact that they were soldiers or had some other experience, or just the art developed because maybe Lichtenauer wasn't such a good fencer, and maybe Martin Sieber or I don't know, Jud Leu were the best fencers of their era. Maybe they influenced everything much more than we know. You know, maybe Lechner is the real deal, right? Maybe Lechner is Lichtenauer all along. You know. We will, unless we find a document which says like, hey, this is me, etc., which really points in that direction, you know, we can't say for sure. We can just, of course, hypothesize and have this wild hypothesis. But, you know, the art was alive. You know, it's so many years. Like, just look at us. I mean, of course, we're living in a different era where video and information exchange is accessible. But, you know, in medieval times, like I don't remember the numbers exactly, but let's say the whole population of modern Germany living now is probably the total amount of people living through Middle Ages in Europe, right? So you have your average medieval city which had like maybe 10,000 people living in, and that was a huge city by those by the time. And you know, in those small areas, those people had constant information exchange. It's impossible Paulus Kahl didn't know about Hans Talhofer. It's impossible. Those guys were basically meeting all over the place because there were not so many guys and not so many guys doing the same stuff. So, and in those years, it's Jesus Christ, it's, I don't know, 50 years since probably Lichtenauer died sometime in the 1440s. Probably, we don't know. I mean, okay, I'm just making stuff up. And in those 50 years, oh my God, there must have been so many good fencers, so many good masters, so many people doing their own stuff that it kind of developed in ways that we cannot even comprehend nowadays. We're just holding on to scraps, onto things that we can find and hypothesize. So I don't really know in which way it was influenced. I can just guess that there existed some scholarly version of the Zettel, which, of course, we have Lechner, who already has the thing, which is quite different to the Zettel, but it's the Zettel, but not really. But yeah, but not really, right? And and this was just one guy. So the reasons elude us, and it is completely possible. It might have been, I don't know, their soldier experience, but it also might have been something regionally very specific, which can be also case of medal, because medal may be regionally specific. We don't know. Perhaps he came from a city, or he was living in a city which had like super tough restrictions on fencing as general, and he had to develop a weird way of fencing in order to conform with those specific rules. That's why his fencing is so weird. But we don't know. We can just guess.
Something you said in the middle of that, I just want to reemphasize, because it's probably one of the most profound things that I've heard in regard to understanding this, right? Like, everybody wants to kind of take a timestamp and be like, the OG was the best, right?
Yeah.
So, Lichtenauer has to be this like sort of like godly figure, or some sort of like a deity. But you said the fencing was alive, and I was like, damn, that's really good. Like, that is exactly how we need to be looking at this. Like, that, of course, like, that's because it just hits every point of, like, we can have an argument on like very specific minutia and things that are going on, but to say the fencing was alive, just really, like, anybody who's lived more than probably, let's say like 30 years is going to think about that, and they're going to instantly think about, like, who was I, 10 years ago? Who was I 20 years ago? And you think about how much you've changed, and like the things and how life's experiences have made you a different person. And then you apply that same logic to, what happens with a living tradition, as so many different factors change. And it makes so much sense, right? Like, man, that was good. So I don't know.
I mean, look at Lekirchner. Right? Again, let's look at Lekirchner for a moment. Like, we have this guy who was in his, 70s, late 60s when he was writing the book, and he doesn't need to write, it is Lichtenauer, but it is not, and we don't know why. We don't know. Perhaps, like I said, he was the OG Lichtenauer, whatever, but he wasn't attributing this to anyone. He didn't say, like, oh, there was this Grandmaster Lichtenauer. No, this is me, and this is my Storksnabel. This is my whatever scorpion, and he didn't care. And that's why this book is very good, because it's him. Okay, he owns the book. He took the ownership, and he's not afraid to do that. And that's why it's good, because it's not just a copy. Copy has no soul. It has no added value. It maybe just strengthens the notion that there is a certain lineage or certain, like, let's say, middle ground from which things go to the sides and stem. But at the end of the day, it's all of these guys who are unique in what they say, because they give us much better information, and also a better tool to look retrospectively at let's say, at Lichtenauer.
Yeah. I mean, I think you can say the same thing for the Bolognese fencing tradition. Like, if you were to look at an author like Giovanni dall'Agocchie, recently I found information that probably definitely indicates that dall'Agocchie is had received knowledge from Marazzo, or from Sebastiano Marazzo, and that's what he's imparting. But like, the considerations that he makes when he talks about the fencing of the day of the old masters, the ancients, was wide, and now everybody fences narrow. I mean, he's writing in 1572, so he's just taking, the same lessons that he had learned from that pedagogical stem, and he's just applying them to the changes that are relevant to the day. But again, the tradition was alive. He's inheriting something, and he's adapting it to meet his environment, as anyone should. So we've brought up the Marxbrüder a couple times, but for newer folks, or casual people Bolognese people who have no idea about German history, who were the Marxbrüder?
That's a good question. Who were the Marx-Brüder? No, really. So things we know again. Marx-Brüder were a fencing guild, but the fencing guild in the very sense of the word, it means that they had a thing which was called imperial privilege. So they were given some rights by emperor in Germany in 1491, 2, whatever. Sorry, I don't exactly remember right now. But they were given rights that they were able to attest new fencing masters. They were able to give out the title of a fencing master, so someone who had the knowledge and the imperial privilege, so they were able to take money for teaching. Because of course, people back 500 years ago, they had same issues like we do. Probably not social media, but they also had like people who were false teacher, who were just trying to fool you, who didn't really teach you like well enough. So they were trying to create a systematic approach to something, along, of course, with plenty of other things. Okay, so ever since second half of 15th century, they were the only ones who could appoint you a regular fencing master. And when we say regular fencing master, is that you can hold the title of the master of the Longsword, okay, or the holder of imperial privilege, whatever. Besides this right, they had headquarters in Frankfurt, and each year during the autumn fest, they organized like a public fencing school where all the people who wanted to become fencing masters gathered from all around, let's say, Europe. I mean, it's not the correct term, but for imagination it will be enough. And they were to show themselves in front of audience and in front of these masters, and they were examined by them. And if they passed the exam, which we spoke about in the beginning, they could become a holder of the imperial privilege. They also had to do. They also needed to swear to pay money, of course, and to swear that they are not gonna meet with horse. Oh, you see, I forgot this one completely. So in order to become a fencing master, you should not meet with horse and butchers. I mean, of course. I mean, you see, I mean, this is what takes a fencing master. So yeah, so more or less they were active up to 17th century, and in the second half of 16th century there were of course most probably different guilds, and we are most familiar with the guild which is called Federfechter, or the Saint Vitus Fechters, who were there like competition, and they were always like competing against each other, who's better, like Federfechters or Marx-Brüder. And at the beginning of 17th century, also Federfechters were given official rights of like imperial privileges from I think it was Rudolf II in Prague, I think 1612 or something like that. So there were multiple fencing guilds, but in general they were the regulation body. They were something like a federation which was able to take money from people, or which had the imperial privilege to take money and to distribute money in between their members. They also held secrets, and those secrets were probably related to fencing, and also other probably monetary secrets or whatever in their guild. So more or less these are the Marx-Brüder.
Yeah, and so in the Federfechter, they still had to go to the Marx-Brüder to get a certification to be a fencing master, right? But if they didn't, like, they could get a Marx-Brüder to certify them, but if they weren't a member of the Marx-Brüder, then they could have the title of like Federfechter, right? Or Freifechter. They could be a Freifechter. Yeah, and so like that's where like Meyer had been probably certified by a Marx-Brüder at some point, something like that. I remember reading that.
This is another problem because there's not much research. Like I'm not really a historian. I'm a huge amateur in it. Okay, so I'm always trying to look at these things from a point of view of a fencer. So I'm trying to incorporate my practical knowledge of historical sources and of the practical knowledge, and to kind of reverse it, look at it from the other side. Like, how does this technical knowledge of fencing influence the inner workings of a medieval federation of longsword or whatever, right? And but we don't really have enough research and sources in this area, again, to put some claims, because there were multiple guilds, not just these people. There were, like, we know about Freifechters, and are Freifechters the same as Federfechters? Like, probably in some places yes, but then again in some places not really. Okay, then when did they come around? Whether they spread just as an opposition to newly formed or officially formed Marxbrüder, because of course people didn't like if certain people were the only ones able to do something, etc., etc. So there's not enough information just on this topic, so we can just guess, and most of our guesses are quite wild in this.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some from a historiographical perspective. There we go. I got it that time.
Yeah.
There's some reason for, the development of the Freifechter outside of the Marxbrüder, even in metal. So relating it back to metal in particular, because it does talk about how to venerate the saints and having to participate in mass and things like that. And you can imagine, to a Calvinist, having to step into a Catholic mass, or pay homage to a saint that you thought was iconography. That would be heretical, and so especially with somebody like Meyer, who we know is a Calvinist, that would be bad news.
Yeah, exactly. That's another very important perspective that kind of eludes us, because you don't normally think about it nowadays, right? Like, what does it mean to be like a Calvinist, a Protestant, and how problematic was it for a Protestant to go to the Church of Most Holy Virgin Mary in Frankfurt, right?
Yeah. But again, like, when I put my history nerd hat on, because like that is my jam, like it's fencing and history. Like, that was one of the things that kind of stood out to me a little bit, is like, that's kind of one of those things where, like, that jars with me. It just kind of, like, it snaps me into that right mindset. So have you been following, do you know Liam Clark? Do you know his research with the evergreen fencing? He's been doing a whole bunch of really...
He's doing an amazing job.
It's so good. So for those of you who don't know, go check out Liam's work on evergreen fencing on Substack. It's really great, and I'll put a link in the notes. But you always see furriers roll up to Fechtschule as Marxbrüder. So why do Lichtenauer's patrons hate PETA?
That's a good question, Josh. That's a really good question. I just think they were people with enough money to buy in their spot.
Yeah, fair enough. All the money that you had to put forward to become a fencing master. All right. What specifically about Metal's text really blew your mind the first time that you read it, or kind of engaged with it?
Oh man, absolutely everything. I mean, I still remember the first time I ever read it, because I got a transcription. What was it, 2009 or something like that, from a Czech historian, and I started, and he was like, "Hey, can you translate this for me in exchange for the transcription?" I was like, "Yeah, sure." I mean, back then I was like doing translations, like just writing it out, and it started like kind of normal, and I was like, "Why, this is normal?" And then, what is this? What is this? So, I had this idea of homogenic, or of course, of some homogeneity. Is that the word, or did I just make it up?
Yeah, a homogeneity, I think, or you might be closer to it than I am, but yeah.
Yeah, so
Homogeneous.
So the homogeneous. So the all of Lichtenauer's art was quite homogeneous for me, and suddenly there was this guy who was like he ate mushrooms, like the good mushrooms, right? And
Yeah.
it was just so wild. Like all the techniques were different. He used different names for different positions and stuff, and I couldn't like comprehend like why is this happening? Like why is this guy doing it? Like how is this? How does this even work? And my brain was completely rejecting those ideas. Like, I mean, and that's good because I wouldn't be able to comprehend it. In order to understand metal, you really need to understand fencing a bit more. Okay, and when I say a bit more, you need to be versed in other sources. You need to understand exactly how things developed, and then it of course makes sense. We also need some practical knowledge, right? Because in the last 2 years, perhaps, at least in Central Europe, a lot of the advanced guys, they started to play with crooked positions, okay? And when I say crooked positions, I really mean that they do two Fechten from, let's say, a Krumbhau, okay? But not like Bam Bam, but really like staying upon someone with a Krumbhau and really luring them in a particular play, etc., etc. And watching those people, and also, I mean, of course, I also experimented with this in my fencing. It made me appreciate and understand the tactical aspects of metal much more than just comparing him plainly with the proclamations that are to be found in Lichtenauer sources. Okay, so the first thing definitely that blew my mind was all the differences, but now it's all the differences again, but from
I get it. That's yeah. No, I think that's good. We'll talk about some of the differences here in a minute. Some of my favorite things, in particular in the first part of the book, I'm still working my way through the textual part, was the fact that the Marxbrüder had a swear jar. Like if you if you ever cursed your opponent in any way, then you had to pay to a specific fund as a penance. And then my other favorite one was that there was a waived spectator fee for buying drinks for the fencers. So that was great. That was pretty good. I also kind of really enjoyed the fact that so many of the regulations were around like the idea of like how to keep the fencers sober before the fencing bout, and then afterwards, like, hey, like once it's over, guys, you can. Yeah. That was good. Because it does,
and it really makes you think. It really makes you think, like, for instance, besides the drinking, there is this 2 or 3 small rules regarding the swords that are used for fencing. I don't know if you remember it. They said that in case the swords get damaged, the guy who damaged it needs to bring a replacement, okay? And the replacement must not be welded, it must not be glued. Yeah. How? Okay, I have questions. I mean, but of course, probably they were talking about specific parts of, for instance, when I don't know the handle falls off or whatever. I mean, I don't know how they glued the blade or whatever. But again, why do rules exist? They exist because somebody glued the sword. Somebody probably was so smart or was trying to play the smartass. And they just glued the sword together, and they said, like, no, look, it's in one piece. Sorry, you told me it should be in one piece. This is in one piece. So they needed to introduce a rule where they said, like, you cannot glue it. It has to be like a finished sword. And then it makes you think, like, okay, we have these 20 or 25 feathers surviving. We don't really know their provenance. Like, sometimes we know that they are older origin. Sometimes we know that they're most probably 19th century fakes or whatever. But if you are in a fencing guild, and if you know that if you break a sword, you will have to replace it, then what will you do? You will make the stupidest sword possible. You will make the thickest, heaviest, sturdiest sword which will survive these schools, because you know that they will be probably attended by people from different cities, people you don't know, people will be competing and hitting each other like crazy. I mean, I don't believe in in tempered fencing schools. I mean, don't believe the guys who are doing the Fechtschule because they think it's like slow fencing. No, those guys were really going after each other. I mean, of course, not 100% of the times, but drinks and fencing don't go together well, as we can read from many contemporary accounts. So then again, what if all the stupid fencing swords that we have surviving, what if all those swords are actually like bad swords because they needed swords that will survive that fencing, and they are not really like something that even the medieval people would, or Renaissance people would consider a good fencing sword, right? So this is a very good food for thought, because even it might not be completely true. Of course, it might be completely different, and probably it's always like there has to be some Occam's razor in this. But things like, if somebody brings you drinks, they don't have to pay a spectator's fee. They make you think about what was actually happening on those schools. Like, those people were swearing like crazy, right? It was probably the best source of income for them, okay? And if they had such a strict rules against lifting the weapons or hitting somebody if they give their stick in front of you, and that means like you should stop fighting or whatever. I mean, it was happening all the time. So you can imagine the public spectacle and those fencers, how it looked like. And this is where Liam's work comes in, right? Because Liam's work presents exactly those little pieces which say like those people were drunkards, gamblers. They always meant trouble for every city. Of course, they needed to regulate those fencers. Of course, it was much needed. Of course, those people didn't have money. Of course, they were meeting up with whores and butchers or whatever. And that's how you paint the picture of real fencing school. You know, not by ideal turnhouse and ideal 24 windings, but by drunk people brawling in a city, disrespecting everybody, up to the point that you have to have a city policeman present all the time, you know?
Yeah. I take personal offense to medals, or, well, not medal, but in this case, but the Frankfurt rules against the butchers, that the Bolognese system is so firmly rooted in the Butchers Guild in Bologna that the entire history of Bologna through most of the period that we study is just a whole bunch of people who originated from the Butchers Guild, like the Bentivoglio family, Manciolino, and so on and so forth. So to me, that struck me personally. I was like, this is rude, but I get it.
Yeah. But the Germans, man.
There might actually, so, kind of going back to the historiographical aspect of things and kind of providing some nuggets in there. One of the things, the reason why the butchers were kind of the military arm of the Bentivoglio is because by city regulation in the city of Bologna, they could carry weapons when other people couldn't. So they could carry a concealed knife because it was their profession, right? So I wonder if medals disparaging of butchers has similar kind of aspects where those guys legitimately could be carrying a live weapon if you're not carrying a live weapon. You know what I mean? Or something concealed. So it's always an interesting consideration. So in metal, I still have a ways to go, but I kind of wanted to wrap this up with kind of talking a little bit about how he talks about vor, knock, strong, weak, and indus. Because that was one of the parts, when I read that, I was like, nah, that makes sense. He, let me grab my copy too. So when he talks about vor and knock in particular, the thing that he discusses that struck me is how he talks about, well, let me read it.
Okay.
Or do you want to read it? Do you want it to be like audiobook version where people can hear Martin Fabian's voice reading the book?
Nah, come on, I enjoy listening to you.
Thanks, man. Let me see. Make sure that I'm on the right spot here. Oh, that was... So he says, the text of the lesson on the words of vor and knock. Vor and knock. Well, actually, before I do that, let me throw something in there real quick, because there's a line before this that I don't know if this struck you when you read it, because it struck me. He says, when you're closing on someone in the approach, you should wait for his cut or wait... You should not wait for his cut or wait for him to attack you. Any fencer who waits for his opponent to cut does nothing but parry, will not enjoy this art very much, for they will often be hit by it. Therefore, cut and thrust into openings. Also remember that all your attacks should be made with the full force of your body, so on and so forth. He kind of contradicts himself a little bit when he's talking about vor and knock, and that's why I wanted to touch on that. So his commentary on the Zettel here, it says, vor and knock, these two things, are the origin of all art. Schweck, Strick, and Indes. Remember that, so that you can teach others to attack and defend with the art. If you are easily frightened, you'd better not learn fencing. And then the commentary, this section says that you should primarily learn and understand two concepts, namely vor and knock, or before and after. Then also Schweck and Strick on the sword, meaning the strong and weak. The word indes, or within, meanwhile, because the whole art of fencing is based on these things. If you understand these things correctly, but above all, do not forget the concept of indes and all the techniques you will do, you will be a good master. Vor. Vor means that you should, if you want, always come with a cut or a thrust to the opening first, so that your opponent has to parry you. Then, after the parry, work skillfully further with the sword from one opening to the next. In this way, your opponent will not be able to counterattack. If he charges at you, then come vor with some grappling or tip dropping. Right, and then you had a footnote there describing what tip dropping means, and that it's probably the Überlaufen, right?
Durchlaufen.
Yeah, Durchlaufen, that's right. Knock. Knock means that if you can't get the vor, or this is where I guess he's not contradicting himself. He's contradicting the teachings of Lichtenauer and the Lichtenauer tradition, because this is his personal note. So it says knock means that if you can't get the vor, and then he adds in a note, or don't want to be vor for some reason, which is such a good note. Then work knock. All counterattacks to all techniques used on you are knock. Understand this. If your opponent comes vor, that is before you do, so that you have to parry it, then attack subsequently indes, from the parry skillfully to the nearest opening. You will thus hit him before he finishes or starts his technique. This way you'll get to the vor and your opponent will be knock. Also make sure that during the knock and vor, you work indes towards the strong and weak of the opponent's sword. Understand this from the crossguard of the middle of the blade is the strong, with the weak, it is easy to resist the opponent in the binds if he gets on it. Or with the strong, it is easy to resist the opponent if he gets on it. Furthermore, from the center of the sword to the tip, the sword has a weak part. With it, you won't be able to resist an opponent. If you understand these things fully, you'll be able to work with the art properly and use it to defend yourself. You'll be able to teach princes and lords, so on and so forth. So what I found incredibly interesting there is I had a conversation with Jess Finley not too long ago, and we were talking about vor and knock, and I made a comment about how vor is acting first and then sort of maintaining the lead and the engagement. That's kind of generally how I think of it. And her comment was, yeah, but if I do nothing, then I'm still in the vor. And we wrestled with that, and we were talking about a whole bunch of different techniques and kind of getting in this like really intense discussion on the subject. It was really interesting. But metal, the way that he describes it, it's so good because it, in a lot of ways, it reads to me like how I understand fencing from a lot of other sources. So like when he says that if you're fencing from the knock, you want to wait until the person does their second action and then try to act in the motion of their second action, right? So like if you're going to fence from the knock, you'll make your first parry, and then you want the second action to develop before you give your action. That's such a Bolognese concept. Like that's literally kind of the tactical paradigm of how the Bolognese authors want you to defend. Because Marazzo and Manciolino basically say that like even when you're attacking, you want to renew your attack before your opponent comes to a fixed position, like before they come to guard, right? Which means that they finish their motion. Because if you think like tempo, here we go. Tempo is the motion between two guard positions, right? So if they finish their guard position, then they can go ahead and start a new tempo, right? If I renew my attack in the middle of their motion, then they're not going to be able to finish, and therefore they're just going to give this really long and elongated tempo that I can exploit, right? They're going to be weak. They're not going to be structured because it's hard to kind of like move with structure when you're getting interrupted constantly. And that's what I see from that. And it just strikes me as so brilliant. I love it.
And mainly going against everyone and saying, you don't have to if you don't want to. You know? It's such an important thing to say, because Medal later on, when he will progress in reading, mainly towards his own part, he explores the concept of nach even more, because he says like that there is like an extra step when you are purposely waiting. You're purposely waiting someone. You are nach. Okay, so. But I don't want to really spoil this, but it's whether you like his approach of fencing, whether you like to work with all those crooked positions, because basically he's like a windshield wiper all the time. You have to admit that guy understood fencing. It's like Fabrice, right? Fabrice gives many clues that he was more or less a sail fencer. So again, we have some traces that he was hired as an assassin, whatever, but sometimes he says these weird little things, right? But I'm not sure if this would work with a sharp sword. And I'm like, dude, who should know that if not you? Because you are living that time. It's like if I was teaching, like, I don't know, shooting with tactical shotguns, and I would say like, oh yeah, but if you want to, kill someone, you do this or this, but I'm not sure if it would work, like, why are you saying this? Like, you are the guy to know if it works or not, right? So, but you can still feel that Fabrice absolutely understood like fencing. He has a brilliant take on fencing, and it's the same with this guy, whether you like his approach or not, because also he's very specific. Like Fabrice is very front-leaned. This guy is extremely crooked from all the possible cuts and angles. You cannot deny that his knowledge was vast. It takes balls to actually write a Lichtenauer's book and say like, yeah, no. Yeah, some people say this is better, but I don't think so. Like, Jesus Christ. What a sentence. What a sentence.
Yeah.
Oh, genius.
Yeah, it's... It also just makes the book incredibly entertaining, because you're just the way that you put it in the book, which again is as beautiful as Fechtbuch Fabian. It's a beautiful presentation, but almost in a biblical sense, whoever the commentator is in blue ink instead of like red ink, as you would see in like biblical texts. but he's got this. You just kind of like you find yourself just longing for his commentary. It's so good.
Exactly. Yeah, it's so good. But I don't like it. This is the traditional way. This is better. Amazing text,
Yeah.
This guy was the real deal. If only more people would see that. I mean, I really, really hope this book will spark some medallion fencers. Although I'm a bit skeptical because the presentation is difficult. I mean, I tried my best, but the presentation on his take is very difficult. And also, like, in order to fence like him, you really need to have some solid understanding of fencing. But I mean, if they will be, I will be very happy. I will be very happy to observe and learn, right? Because right now I have the feeling that I'm more or less alone in this. I mean, but then again, it took me 16 years. All right, so there's nowhere to rush.
I really have hope, and I follow you in this. I really do think that there will be people who kind of take this approach. So you talk about how metal is sort of advanced, right? Before we were talking about like how to build into Paulus Hector Meyer. So if you had to build into metal, how would you do it?
Jesus, Mother of Mary. Jesus. Okay, so I would probably take an extremely experienced fencer, someone like maybe Antek, maybe Miroslav Medved, that's a local fencer who really experiments with all those positions. And I would take those guys and I would explain some of the rationale which is in metal, and I think it would be really serving for them well, because they would be like, oh, of course. They would totally understand what he means when he says, like, from this Mittelhau, go and make a Krumbhau, make a Twirhau with a Krumbhau against Flug, Alber, whatever position. Like, they would understand, like, why they crook arms like this. They would probably understand, like, why to cut from the outside line from our left if somebody is cutting from the right, etc., etc. So I think it would be extremely difficult we could create new fencers by concealing everything else and just making them exposed to medallion way of thinking. You would probably need a pair of people, and you would need to cut them out from any videos they can see on fencing, and you would have to make them fence together a lot in a very specific environment. And you would get really, really good Schulfechten, because I think like medal is like the highest Schulfechten point. And you could get those people, but the moment they would meet with, let's say, core Lichtenauer fencers or core someone, a modern practical fencer, they would struggle. And I don't think they would struggle because medal is bad. Quite the opposite. It's just he is really into crooked things and some crooked positions. And in order to make it work, you also need a very good knowledge of how the other things work, because I need to understand how things behave from, let's say, a Langort in order to be able to work against it, because I have to have this whole notion of like tactics and strategy that comes out of it. All right, so you could make the simple logic of metal work, because it's not a difficult logic. It's not difficult logic at all. He says like, you've got this starting position, you've got this parry, and you've got this sitting position, and then you just go and do winden and some, I don't know, some throwing and stuff like that, which is not difficult at all, but it takes a lot of tactical thinking, and it takes a lot of like general strategical knowledge in order to arrive there, right? So it's like, you know, a similar thing happens with Mayer people, right? You have plenty of people doing this Fechtschule thing,
and they are in their closed environment where everything is like working, of course, right? All the tricks work like from a book, and then they come to their first tournament, and somebody just doesn't care, and they just launch a direct on thrust or just a one-handed attack or whatever. It doesn't really matter, and then their system is shattered because it meets outside elements which do not respect the system. And medal heavily depends in some ways on certain approaches and rules, and then there is a gap when it doesn't work, and then there is the high knowledge where you have certain mastery of fencing, let's say, and you can make medal work because you understand the simple rationale behind this thinking, right? So yeah, that would be my answer. Like, we could theoretically make full medal people from beginners, but I don't think they would be happy during their first tournament. But if you take good tournament people and teach them the ways of medal, and they understand, like, not bad actually, then medal will fully work for us.
So
because
what if
it's like just one more thing, sorry, because medal is a Schulfechten product. He's a product of all those drunken people meeting somewhere on a square each Sunday and fencing like crazy. And at some point, it's like this is an effect which happens in your school, in our schools. Maybe you also know it. If there are 20 people in your fencing club who are fencing together all the time, there will be 2 or 3 techniques which work for them because they're like specific for your school. Like this is the Fiore school where every other exchange ends with a kick in the groin. And then you will have 20 people kicking each other in the groin because this is something which works in their specific environment, in their specific level of understanding, etc. So we had these medallion people somewhere at some square doing this every Sunday, fighting, 200 sparring bouts or whatever, Gänge in German, like each Sunday after Mass, okay? And they developed this specific system which really worked for them, which has logic. And the question is, where do we find this logic? That's why it would really help us if we could locate medal in which part of Germany he was active. I mean, probably somewhere around Augsburg, probably, in order to track like how this came to be, right? And this is high Fechtschule for me because it works in the Fechtschule environment. It's really suitable for a Fechtschule environment, but also, of course, we can take it practically into our modern tournaments. Yeah, sorry for the rant. This was really long.
No, I love it. I think that it's super fascinating. I think, if you study anything, I would say to some degrees, I think you could see something very similar in the Bolognese tradition, right? Like nobody starts with Marazzo. Or nobody really starts with the Anonimo Bolognese, right? Like the Anonimo is like such an advanced source because there's so many like really interesting like beats, and you're breaking their sword down to the ground, right? And when does that stuff really come into play? You have to know how to fence like dall'Agocchie with very narrow, like very controlled approach in order for the Anonimo to really make sense. And when you understand that approach, then you can like once you realize like that person is kind of giving you those tactical outliers that you can start exploiting, that's when all of a sudden you can say, I can finally use the Anonimo, And it's kind of like what we were talking about earlier with kind of like that, the sort of the variations of various guards. And you were talking about how metal likes to fence very crooked. You can play around with the concept like long point and start holding long point as Alber or whatever. Marazzo loves to play in Porta di Ferro Larga, which is basically Alber. And a lot of that is Marazzo is again writing for a very controlled environment. That's the Lucca school, and that's what he's like very used to. So it's pretty fascinating stuff. Do you have any?
If you want to make a similar exercise, just like very briefly, we spoke about Guardia di Testa. Okay, so where does it come from? Where does it go? I mean, normally you're just, this is Guardia di Testa, you hold it like this, but then start thinking about it as a fencer. Don't think about it as a interpreter of long dead art. Think about it as fencer. Try to think about it tactically and strategically and find use for it, because, from a normal point of view, if you are a average skilled practical fencer, sorry, microphone is showing my sad dog to me right now. So if you are tactical and you have some ideas about fencing, and imagine you see someone going against you in a garb like that, and you're like, I mean, he's giving me those arms for free. I mean, why does he have such a weird opening over there? I'm gonna take it immediately. So again, but you can make it work, of course, with enough measure control and with enough good tempo recognition. You can make it work, of course. But then again, the main question is how does it come into fencing? How did those guys develop this specific and weird position, and how were they using it practically in time when their hands were much more endangered? Well, I mean, and those are the things that might have a fencing practical sense. They say okay, so if you do something like this, it's really easier if you do Blossfechten or I don't know, fencing without armor, to start from this position. It's really easier for some reason that eludes us. Or maybe at some point it was forbidden to hit the arms or hit the hands because it was an off target. And if you put your hands in front of this like this, you are basically absolutely doing something which won many matches for some people at Bohemia last week, because since arms were valued as a lower priority target, you just put them in front enough so they become the only target your opponent can hit, and you basically are in a position where you can easily launch an attack through their guard. So these are the practical things that we have to solve as fencers. And also when approaching things like medal, which are advanced for the reasons I already outlined briefly, we have to think about them as fencers, not as trying to reconstruct just the mechanical aspects of the exercise, because those are boring and everybody can do that. But ask yourselves the real question: how can I use this practically, and what are the things that I am achieving with this particular position, right?
Yeah, man, you said a lot of really good stuff in there. But I think it's I don't know.
I make a similar exercise with Furies. I'll make another thing if somebody says I love Fiore, and I'm I give them a simple question how do you practically get into the first distance in Larga? How do you bind somebody's sword at the tip?
Right.
Because it makes little sense.
Right. Yeah. Right? Yeah. No, for sure. That's and I mean, I've heard some wild theories about Fiore's different measures that don't make a lot of sense to me, because I feel like people are missing the point of what Fiore is doing. I think Fiore is only showing you what the Bolognese authors would show, what would consider mezzospada, right? So they're only showing you the Krieg. He's teaching you the Krieg. That's my personal Fiore theory. You may not agree, but what I do find is interesting though is I've done this before. I was in a tournament and there were a number of top 25 sword and buckler fencers that were fencing in this tournament with me. And because sword and buckler is usually fought very narrow, people will just kind of hang out in low guards and fence relatively narrow. And by that, Codalunga Stretta, Codalunga Alta, so right, left flug. I fenced that tournament primarily from Guardia Alta. And I had one of the really high level fencers come up to me afterwards, and he was like, I didn't know what to do with that because I never fence anybody who fences from Guardia Alta. And I was like, that's exactly why I was doing it. And because, I had been looking at Marazzo's, his second section with the sword and small buckler and his approach from wide to narrow, right? And so that's one of the things that kind of struck me in what you were talking about is sometimes all you're really trying to do, the answer is in what we talked about with the vor and the knock in metal. Sometimes all you're trying to do with those guard positions is just create movement from your opponent. So you might start from Guardia di Testa, but the variability of Guardia di Testa or, Myers Spreckfenster is that it's such an interesting position to be in that any movement from that guard is going to initiate movement from your opponent that then you can take advantage of, right? So again, like understanding those core concepts of fencing, like you can start to play with things to, like, what are you trying to achieve in your opening engagement? Like there's so much of this, like, I've got to strike at the person, like, yeah, you can strike at the person, but what are you actually trying to achieve? And that first movement that you make from a fixed position in a guard is, again, going back to Marazzo, you're hunting, you're trying to get them to come out of that guard position so you can take advantage of it and continue forward with your attack. And people just, they want that, like, I'm going to hit them in first intention, and like my first intention is going to be so powerful. And that works sometimes if things are correct, right? But like understanding that you're looking for visual cues and it's more of a dance and you're reading how your opponent is moving. And if they do something that, like, you have to understand kind of the decision tree of how the attack develops. Like they either do exactly what you want and you can hit them with that first intention attack, or they do something completely different and then you have to go to whatever your plan B is, or like whatever the sort of the baked in intention is that you can develop out of that. Yeah.
And then the meta changes because next year everybody's gonna do Guardia di Testa. And that's why fencing is amazing, because this is and it worked the same 500 years ago. It wasn't different. That's how it was changing,
Yeah. Well, like you said, we can end on this because I know your dog is craving your attention. But
my stomach is also craving some food.
Yeah, me too. My stomach's been growling the whole time. But speaking of keeping things alive, like you said, it's a living tradition, and that's what's beautiful. And this just gives us a new piece of that. So. Before we go and, get some sustenance, where can people go to find your books?
So I'm self-published. I took the risk of self-publishing my books because I like to have more creative control over them, and also to kind of make it easier to purchase somehow. I mean, I understand it's not the easiest for people living abroad, but I have tried to make the process as seamless as possible. The books are available on my personal webpage. It only sells these 2 books, I mean, in English, and eventually it will sell also ebooks because they are basically done. I just have some issues with the export, and right now I'm very busy with life, like very busy, and so if you want to get my books, please go to martinfabian.sk. There's also like an English version of the page. And if you visit martinfabian.sk, you will just see book 1, book 2, and you can pick it up. And the good news for American listeners and future readers is there are no tariffs on books.
That's right.
So far. Until your president will open a bookstore, then there will be tariffs on books which he is not selling, of course. So, or which he is selling,
if you just
he will, of course,
slap a picture of his face on the cover, there will be no tariffs.
Tariffs. No tariffs. 200%. So, yeah. So, if you want my books, just martinfabian.sk.
Yeah. And we'll start a sword smuggling business here soon so we can get some ciggies into the United States. It's going to be like the old days. We're going to have like a sword mafia. You're going to have to ship to Canada and Mexico, and then we're going to have people along the border just like running swords across the border to avoid tariffs. Yeah.
Or just swim through Lake Ontario. Boat.
Dude, those lakes are so... Have you ever been to the Great Lakes?
No.
Oh,
I've been
they
here,
are so
but not
big.
there directly.
They are so big. it's like the ocean. There's no, it's wild. We'll have to take you up there sometime. But Martin, I know you need to go, so this has been an absolute blast. Thank you very much for engaging with me in this conversation and talking about your works. I love them. Thanks for sending them to me, and I look forward to talking in the future. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for having me here for the second time. I mean, I'm always happy to talk. I like talking. And I want to thank to everybody for listening and also to reading my books. I mean, my motivation was always clear, because if I can help to make the fencing environment a little better, at the end of the day, I will also benefit from it, because the better people all around the globe, the better I am. The more I see of people using crooked positions, the more I will also learn, because of course my views are also limited just to me and my experience. So thank you for having me, Josh. It was a real pleasure, and thanks to everybody who's made it this far, because this is probably a very long podcast.
Yeah, well, we almost hit 3 hours, so that's good. That's good.
Yeah.
All right.
That's good. So have a nice day, and thank you.